For decades, people believed the story behind MASH was simple: great writing, great chemistry, and a cast that worked like a family. But Alda has quietly revealed something very different. Behind the laughter and unforgettable scenes, there were moments of real tension, arguments that didn't stay behind closed doors, and decisions that changed the direction of the show forever. One disagreement in particular didn't just divide two actors. It forced everyone involved to confront what kind of story they were really telling. And now, years later, Alda is finally opening up about what really happened. Long before the tension that would later define some of the show's most powerful moments, Alda approached MASH with a very specific mindset, one that would eventually put him at odds with people around him. When he first read the script, he almost turned it down, not because he doubted the writing, but because he was deeply uncomfortable with the idea of turning war into entertainment. At the time, the closest comparison was light-hearted military comedies that treated conflict as a backdrop for jokes. And Alda didn't want to be part of anything that reduced real human suffering into something trivial. It wasn't until he sat down with the creative team and had a long, serious conversation about tone that he agreed to take the role, with one condition in mind. The show had to respect the reality of war, even when it was being funny. That belief didn't stay theoretical. It shaped everything Alda did on set, from the way he delivered lines to how he worked with other actors. He had a deep respect for the script, sometimes to the point where it surprised people around him. In one early moment, he and his co-star Wayne Rogers came across a line that didn't make sense, but instead of changing it, they performed it exactly as written because they trusted the writing so completely. Later, when it turned out to be a typo, Alda admitted that he would rather honor the intention of the script than risk altering something that might have meaning. That level of discipline set a tone for the entire cast, but it also revealed something important about him. He cared less about looking clever and more about getting the story right. At the same time, Alda brought an improvisational background that added another layer to his approach. He believed that actors should listen to each other and react naturally, creating moments that felt real rather than staged. But what looked spontaneous on screen was often the result of careful rehearsal and intense focus. He pushed for scenes that felt alive, not mechanical, and that philosophy began to influence the show more and more as it developed. It wasn't always an easy balance to maintain, especially when other people involved in the production had different ideas about how things should be done. Those differences started to become more noticeable as the show grew in popularity. What began as small creative disagreements gradually evolved into something bigger, a quiet struggle over control and direction. Some people preferred structure, sticking closely to the script and maintaining consistency. Alda, on the other hand, was increasingly focused on authenticity, even if it meant bending the rules. This underlying tension didn't explode immediately, but it created an environment where even a single disagreement could carry far more weight than it seemed on the surface. And eventually, one of those disagreements would change everything. As the show moved into its later seasons, the pressure to maintain both its success and its identity only intensified. And that's when one of the most revealing conflicts began to take shape, not between enemies, but between two actors who actually respected each other. Alda and Mike Farrell, who played B.J. Honeycutt, shared a strong working relationship, but they also approached their characters in very different ways. Alda was always looking for ways to blend humor with realism, often pushing scenes toward emotional truth through subtle improvisation or tonal shifts. Farrell, on the other hand, was deeply protective of his character's moral compass, and he believed that certain lines simply could not be crossed, no matter how compelling the story might be. That difference came to a head during the development of a key storyline involving a controversial surgical decision. The premise was simple on the surface, but complicated underneath. Perform a procedure that wasn't strictly necessary in order to prevent a soldier from returning to the front lines, potentially saving his life. For Alda, this kind of moral ambiguity was exactly what MASH had evolved to explore. War wasn't clean, and the show had reached a point where it could confront uncomfortable truths without losing its humanity. But for Farrell, the issue was more personal. He didn't believe BJ would agree to perform an unnecessary surgery, even for a good reason, because it violated the ethical foundation of the character. What followed wasn't a dramatic public argument, but it was intense enough to reshape the episode itself. The two actors debated the issue from both a storytelling and a moral standpoint, each trying to stay true to what they believed the show represented. Farrell wasn't trying to challenge Alda personally, and Alda wasn't dismissing Farrell's concerns, but their perspectives simply didn't align. One was focused on the broader message about the cost of war, while the other was grounded in the integrity of a single character's choices. It was a quiet but meaningful clash, the kind that doesn't make headlines but leaves a lasting impact on the work. Instead of forcing a compromise that would dilute both viewpoints, the writers leaned into the conflict. The disagreement between Alda and Farrell was written directly into the episode, turning a behind-the-scenes tension into on-screen drama. That decision gave the story a level of authenticity that couldn't have been manufactured any other way. The episode didn't present a clear answer or an easy resolution, and that was the point. It allowed the audience to sit with the discomfort, to question what was right, and to understand that even people working toward the same goal could see things completely differently. In many ways, that moment captured exactly what MASH had become, a show willing to challenge its own characters and even its own actors in pursuit of something more honest. While the disagreement with Mike Farrell revealed how deeply the actors cared about their characters, it wasn't the only tension shaping the direction of MASH. In fact, some of the most persistent friction came from a completely different place, the struggle between structure and creative freedom. Alda had grown increasingly invested in making the show feel real, not just entertaining, and that often put him at odds with director Jackie Cooper, whose approach was far more traditional. Cooper believed in sticking closely to the script, maintaining control, and delivering scenes exactly as written. Alda, however, believed that authenticity sometimes required flexibility, that actors needed room to breathe, to react, and to bring their own instincts into the moment. This wasn't about personal dislike, and Alda would later make that clear. In his own words, it was never about not getting along. It was about vision. He wanted the show to reflect the emotional truth of people living through war, even if that meant taking risks or adjusting how a scene played out. Cooper, on the other hand, saw discipline as the foundation of consistency, especially on a show that had to deliver week after week. Their working styles collided in subtle but noticeable ways, with moments on set where creative discussions became more intense than anyone expected. Crew members would later recall that while things rarely exploded into open conflict, there were times when the tension was impossible to ignore. At the heart of it was a larger question. What kind of show was MASH supposed to be? In its early years, it leaned more heavily on comedy with sharp dialogue and character-driven humor. But as Alda gained more influence, the tone began to shift. Episodes started to explore deeper emotional territory, blending humor with loss, trauma, and moral complexity. This evolution didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't universally welcomed. Some people felt the show was moving away from what had made it successful in the first place, while others believed it was finally reaching its full potential. That transition also affected key figures behind the scenes. Larry Gelbart, one of the show's original creative forces, eventually stepped away, citing exhaustion and the growing pressures of both the network and the changing direction of the series. His departure marked a turning point, signaling that MASH was no longer the same show it had been at the beginning. At the same time, cast changes began to reshape the dynamic on screen. Wayne Rogers left earlier after feeling his role as Trapper. John was being overshadowed by the increasing focus on Alda's Hawkeye, a decision that reflected the shifting balance of the ensemble. Yet these departures also opened the door for new characters like Colonel Potter and Charles Winchester, who brought a different kind of depth and helped redefine the show for a new phase. As the cast and creative direction continued to evolve, the emotional weight of MASH grew heavier, both on screen and behind the scenes, and by the time the show approached its final season, everyone involved understood they were closing a chapter that had defined their lives. What many viewers didn't realize was just how personal that ending felt to the people who had spent over a decade building the series together. Alda wasn't just the lead actor anymore. He had become one of the key creative forces, co-writing and directing the final episode, carrying the responsibility of giving the story a proper goodbye. The finale itself became something unprecedented. When it aired, more than 100 million people tuned in, turning it into a shared experience unlike anything television had seen before. Alda would later recall how the scale of that moment felt almost surreal, describing how entire communities seemed to pause at the same time. There's a story he often tells about how, during the first commercial break, so many people across the country got up at once that it nearly overwhelmed local water systems. It sounds almost unbelievable, but it captured something real: the idea that television, at its peak, could bring millions of people together in a single moment. But behind that historic broadcast was a very different reality. Filming the final episode was emotionally overwhelming for the cast. Alda later admitted that while working in the editing room, he found himself unable to stop crying, not because of the story alone, but because of what it represented. They weren't just finishing a project, they were saying goodbye to a group of people who had become like family. Other cast members felt it just as deeply. Scenes that looked controlled and professional on screen were often filled with real emotion, with actors struggling to separate their characters from their own feelings about the end. And yet, even in that emotional chaos, there was a sense of pride in what they had accomplished. Over 11 seasons, MASH had transformed from a sharp, character-driven comedy into something much more complex, a series that wasn't afraid to explore grief, loss, and moral ambiguity while still finding moments of humor. That balance had come from years of creative tension, disagreements, and constant refinement. In many ways, the conflicts that had once seemed like obstacles had actually shaped the show into what it became. By the time it ended, those struggles were no longer seen as problems. They were part of the reason the show resonated so deeply with audiences. Looking back now, what stands out most about Alda's experience isn't just the conflicts or the success, but the way those moments shaped everything that came after. Even decades later, he continues to reflect on MASH not as a finished chapter, but as something that still lives with him. When he reunited with Mike Farrell to mark a major anniversary of the show, the tone wasn't nostalgic in a superficial way. It was deeply personal. He spoke about how the series had changed their lives, how the people they worked with became more than colleagues, and how the bond they formed never really disappeared. For audiences, the show ended years ago. For Alda, it never fully did. That perspective becomes even more meaningful when you consider what he has faced in his later years. After revealing his Parkinson's diagnosis, Alda didn't retreat from public life or slow down in the way many expected. Instead, he leaned into curiosity, continuing to read, learn, and stay engaged with the world around him. He once explained that dealing with the condition helped him understand something fundamental, that everyone is carrying something, even if you can't see it. That mindset echoes the same emotional honesty he brought to MASH, the idea that beneath humor or normalcy, there is always something deeper happening. His reflections also highlight something that feels increasingly rare today, the sense of shared experience that television once created. Alda has spoken about how, during the finale, millions of people were watching at the same time, reacting together, talking about it the next day. He's contrasted that with the modern habit of watching alone, on demand, where those communal moments are harder to find. For him, it's not just about nostalgia, it's about connection, about the way stories can bring people together when they're experienced collectively. That's part of what made MASH so powerful, and part of what he believes is missing now. And when he talks about the people who were there with him, the tone shifts again. His tribute to Wayne Rogers, his early co-star, reveals how much those relationships meant. He didn't speak in dramatic terms or try to turn it into something larger than it was. He simply described Rogers as smart, funny, curious, and dedicated. Someone who shared a commitment to giving everything to the show. That simplicity carries weight because it feels genuine. In the end, that may be the clearest insight Alda offers. Not that the show was perfect, or that the conflicts didn't matter, but that what endured was the work they did together and the connections they built along the way. So when you look back at MASH, do you see it the same way, knowing what was happening behind the scenes? Or do these conflicts make the story even more powerful? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold stories like this.